Earlier this year, SAP settled its European Commission investigation. What are the parameters of that settlement and what does it mean for you? That's what I want to talk about today. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney, and for over 20 years, I've focused my practice on drafting and negotiating software-related contracts and litigating failed software projects in courts across the country. To understand the scope of the settlement, I think it's helpful to understand what the allegations were. Now, the European Commission was looking at SAP for allegedly using its dominance in on-premise ERP maintenance and support to lock customers in. SAP was allegedly restricting third-party support and imposing unfair trading conditions, according to the Commission. And specifically, the Commission was looking at 4 practices that they say may have restricted competition from third-party providers. And the first one is SAP was requiring customers to obtain maintenance and support from SAP for all of that customer's on-premise SAP ERP software. The next allegation was that SAP was preventing customers from terminating maintenance and support for unused shelfware licenses. So the customer was forced to continue to pay for unwanted services. And then third, SAP was allegedly extending the initial license term during which termination of maintenance and support was essentially restricted, and then restarting terms with additional license purchases. And then the fourth allegation was that SAP was charging essentially a restatement fee and then back maintenance fees to customers returning to SAP support after a period of being off support. And in some cases, these charges effectively equaled would have been paid if the customer had never left SAP. And the EU Commission was concerned that SAP's practices made it hard and more expensive for SAP customers to use or switch to independent third-party providers. So that is essentially the scope of what the allegations were. And now, what were the parameters of the settlement? Well, the EU Commission accepted binding commitments, whatever that means, from SAP, which closed the investigation without a finding of liability or any fine being imposed on SAP. And now these commitments are legally binding on SAP globally for at least 10 years. And so there are substantive restrictions. And I think there is an oversight committee that has been formed to make sure that SAP complies with its commitments. And non-compliance can essentially trigger fines of up to 10% of worldwide revenue, which for a company like SAP is substantive. So the question is, what did SAP specifically agree to? With respect to support, customers have additional rights. They are able to terminate support and maintenance in connection with a failed implementation where SAP is responsible. Customers going through insolvency or bankruptcy have the ability to terminate support and maintenance. Customers going through workforce reductions of a certain percentage also have the ability to terminate. Customers involved with divestitures, transfers of the license to buyers, they all have the ability to terminate their support and maintenance. So I think there's a lot more flexibility coming out of SAP with respect to the ability to terminate maintenance and support. And with respect to the payment of back maintenance and administrative fees associated with back maintenance, that is essentially going to be abolished or reduced. And so what SAP has agreed to do is reduce or cap back maintenance fees to the lower of 50% of what would have been due for the off-support period, or 6 months of fees. And there's a full waiver for certain outdated, unsupported products. So I think that's a significant concession on SAP's part. And I will tell you, from my time at SAP, that was an incredibly common contract scenario. With respect to contract clarity and flexibility, SAP agreed to clarify rules on initial license terms with respect to no automatic restart of new minimum terms with additional purchases of software. They have agreed to broader access to single metric contracts, so they're meaning a single way to calculate license fees, and where those fees then drive maintenance and support payment obligations. They've implemented internal processes. They've created a clearing structure mechanism for customer complaints. And so, I think the takeaways from all this are really important. And one, the primary takeaway is that this is not applicable to cloud products. And so, it is only applicable to on-premise solutions. And that seems, it seems kind of like a narrow victory in some ways. But I think the real takeaway from this is that when you're faced with a contract negotiation with SAP, you can still use the settlement information to inform your negotiation. And I think without the ability to leverage these practices on-prem, SAP is going to be incented to leverage these practices in cloud deals. So, I mean, I think you can be assured that what you're seeing from these legacy on-prem deals is really going to rear its ugly head in your cloud negotiation. And so, this is going to be useful to you to be able to inform your negotiation positions. You're going to be able to push back on SAP with greater intensity and clarity. In addition, I think there's going to be reduced pressure to migrate to the cloud. You've got essentially with these concessions kind of a path forward to stay on your legacy on-prem system. The pressure to avoid rising maintenance cost is lessened because SAP is now specifically acknowledging that you can utilize third parties to provide support and maintenance. The pressure to avoid shelfware is not really the same. So I think that with respect to customers with heavily customized systems, with no business case to migrate, they're really going to find that it's going to make more financial sense to stay on the legacy on-prem system. And so with respect to negotiating with SAP, I think you're going to see hardened negotiation positions. You're going to see more aggressive audits from SAP. And I think to some extent, you're probably going to see SAP deprioritizing accounts that do not migrate to the cloud. But the bottom line is very much that these are meaningful concessions, and that third-party support is now a more viable option. I think it was always really a viable option, but I think SAP certainly put barriers in place to mitigate a customer's ability to seek maintenance and support from third parties. And now, with this settlement, I think a lot of this is going to go by the wayside, and I think that's certainly a win for customers. And I think you've got to utilize these data points when you're negotiating with SAP. If you have any questions about anything that I've talked about in this video, please feel free to reach out. I'd love to talk to you and get you pointed in the right direction.